"Don't open that door, Sarah. You have no idea who they are." She heard it, she understood it, and then she put her hand on the handle anyway. Outside, 70 motorcycles. A frozen Montana highway. A storm that had swallowed the night whole, and a young man collapsed in the cold, shaking like a leaf about to break. Everyone told her to lock the door. Sarah Mitchell opened it. That single decision made in less than 3 seconds was about to change her life, her daughter's life, and the lives of 70 strangers she had never met. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel right now and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night had been trying to warn her all day. It started with the sky, the kind of heavy bruised gray that old Montana ranchers read like a newspaper. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped so fast that the thermometer on the diner's back porch cracked right down the middle. Sarah Mitchell noticed it when she stepped outside to haul in a bag of flour, and she stood there for just a moment staring at the broken glass, thinking it felt like some kind of sign. She didn't know what kind yet. She went back inside. The diner was called Mitchell's. It had always been called Mitchell's even before Sarah was born, even before her father, Robert Mitchell, had plastered the hand-painted sign above the door with his own rough hands in the summer of 1987. The building sat on the edge of Route 12, about 11 miles outside of Garrison, Montana, a stretch of 2-lane highway that cut through ranch land and pine forest and didn't apologize for the distance between anything. Truckers knew the place. Farmers knew it. People who drove through just once, 10 or 15 years ago, still remembered the coffee, which was never fancy, but was always hot and always honest. Sarah had inherited the diner 4 years earlier when her father died of a heart attack while sitting in his favorite booth by the window. The county coroner said he went fast and probably didn't feel a thing. Sarah chose to believe that because the alternative was too heavy to carry. What she couldn't choose was the debt he left behind. Robert Mitchell had been a proud man who refused to talk about money. He kept his struggles to himself the way his generation had been taught to, quietly, stoically, with a tight jaw and no complaints. So Sarah had no idea, not until the lawyer spread the papers across the kitchen table, that her father had taken out 2 loans against the property in his final years. Medical bills, equipment repairs, the usual quiet catastrophes that pile up when a small business tries to survive in a world that keeps changing around it. The bank had been patient at first. Then they stopped being patient. 30 days. That was what the letter said. The one she had read so many times that the paper had gone soft at the fold lines. 30 days before foreclosure proceedings would begin. 30 days before the building her father built with his hands, the place where she had taken her first steps, where she had learned to make biscuits, where her daughter Emma had grown up, recognizing the smell of bacon grease as the smell of home. All of it would belong to someone else. 23 of those 30 days were already gone. She told herself she wasn't panicking. She told herself this every morning while standing at the kitchen sink drinking her first cup of coffee before Emma woke up. She told herself she had a plan. She had called the bank 4 times. She had spoken to a lawyer in Billings who charged $200 an hour and ultimately told her what she already suspected, that her options were limited and her timeline was short. The plan, such as it was, amounted to one thing: keep the diner open, keep the money coming in, make it through the next 7 days. Tonight was supposed to be a regular Tuesday. It didn't stay regular for long. The first thing she heard was the sound. She was behind the counter refilling the sugar dispensers when it rolled in from the distance, a low, layered rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the way thunder does when it's still far away but moving fast. She stopped what she was doing. The 2 customers in the back booth, a retired couple named Dale and Priscilla Hurst, who came in every Tuesday for pie, looked up from their plates. "What on earth is that?" Priscilla said. Sarah was already moving toward the window. The highway was dark, the storm having knocked out 2 of the 3 roadside lights that marked the diner's entrance. But she could see them headlights. Dozens of them. Moving in a long, tight formation, like something out of a dream, or maybe a movie, each one trailing close behind the next, the whole column stretching back further than she could see into the dark. "Lord have mercy," Dale said. He had come to stand beside her. They came to a stop in the gravel lot outside. One by one, then all at once, the engines cut. And in the silence that followed, a silence that felt enormous after all that noise, Sarah counted. She couldn't count all of them. There were too many. But she could see the vests, She could see the patches on the back even through the dark in the snow that had started falling again. 3 words were hard to miss. Hells, Angels, MC. Dale Hurst put his hand on her arm. His grip was tighter than she expected from a man his age. "Sarah," he said very quietly, "lock the door." "Dale, I'm serious right now. Lock the door, turn off the open sign, and call the sheriff. They're just, I know who they are." His voice had gone flat in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "My brother-in-law was a deputy for 15 years in Billings. I know exactly who they are. Lock the door, Sarah." Priscilla was already reaching for her purse. Sarah looked back out the window. She saw the bikes. She saw the vests. She saw the sheer number of them spreading out across her parking lot like a tide coming in. And then she saw the boy. He was young. She couldn't tell exactly how young in the dark, maybe early 20s, and he was still on his bike, but he wasn't getting off. He was leaning. Not the casual lean of a man stretching after a long ride. He was leaning the way a person leans when their body is making a decision, without them the way a tree leans before it falls. His head was down. His hands were still wrapped around the handlebars, but they weren't gripping anymore. And then the man next to him, older, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, grabbed him by the jacket just as the boy and the bike began to go sideways together. It happened fast. The older man caught him, called out something Sarah couldn't hear through the glass. 2 others rushed over. The boy's legs were not working properly. That was the only way she could describe it later. He was conscious, she thought, but only just, and his legs were doing what legs do when the body has been cold for too long and has started making cuts to non-essential functions. Dale was still holding her arm. "Sarah, the door." She looked at him. She looked at Priscilla, who had gone very pale. She looked at the phone on the counter, which she could have picked up and called the sheriff's department, which would have sent a deputy in maybe 35 minutes if the roads weren't too bad, and 45 minutes if they were. She looked back at the boy. He was on the ground now. Not dramatically, not like in a movie, just quietly the way people go down when their body simply stops negotiating. The man who had caught him was crouched beside him, one hand on the boy's chest, talking to him in a way that looked urgent. Someone had a flashlight out. Someone else had their phone up, looking for a signal they clearly weren't finding. Sarah moved behind the counter. She grabbed the first aid kit from under the register. She had refilled it last month because Emma had been going through a phase of scraping her knees constantly, and Sarah had made a point of keeping it stocked. She grabbed the 2 extra wool blankets she kept in the back for long winter nights when the heat in the dining room lost its argument with the cold outside. "Sarah." Dale's voice had changed. He wasn't gripping her arm anymore. He was following her, and his voice had shifted from warning to something closer to bewildered. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "What does it look like I'm doing?" she said. "You can't go out there. Someone's hurt. You don't know these people." She stopped. She turned around and looked at him fully, and she understood that he was scared, and she understood that his fear was not without reason, and she also understood that none of that changed anything about what she was about to do. "Dale," she said, "there's a kid on the ground out there who looks like he's about to freeze to death in my parking lot. I'm not going to stand inside and watch that happen." She pushed through the door. The cold hit her like a wall. Montana cold in December is not a polite cold. It does not ease you in. It goes straight for the places you forgot to cover the gap between her collar and her wrists where her sleeves ended the tops of her ears. She was already moving toward the group clustered around the boy, the gravel crunching under her boots, the snow coming down steadily now, in small, hard flakes that felt more like sand than snow. She didn't think about what she looked like. She didn't think about the 70 men in leather vests who were now very much aware of her presence. She kept her eyes on the boy on the ground and she kept moving. The crowd parted for her. Not aggressively, not reluctantly. They simply moved aside the way people do when someone walks toward them with clear intention. She dropped to her knees beside the boy. He was on his back now, his head cradled in the lap of the broad-shouldered man who looked up at her with an expression that she later described as carefully neutral, not hostile, not welcoming, just waiting. "How long has he been like this?" she asked. "Hour, maybe more," the man said. "We've been stuck on a highway. He didn't say anything until about 20 minutes ago. Started talking to people who weren't there." She pulled the blankets loose and handed one to the nearest person without looking up. "Wrap his feet. His boots feel solid, but his feet are what matter right now." She opened the first aid kit. What's his name? Ethan Cole. Ethan! She said it directly to the boy, not to the man. She put her hand on the boy's face. His skin was wrong, not just cold, but the specific kind of cold that comes from inside from a body that has been trying to heat itself for too long and has started losing the argument. His lips had gone a color that scared her bone. Ethan, can you hear me? I need you to squeeze my hand if you can hear me. A pause, then weak, barely there, but real. His fingers closed around hers. She exhaled. Okay, she said. Okay, we need to get him inside. The broad-shouldered man looked at her. There was something in his expression that shifted very slightly, the way a door shifts when the latch releases. You're sure, he said. I'm sure. Your call, he said, not deferentially, just acknowledging that she understood what she was doing. My call, she agreed. Two men lifted Ethan carefully, one at his shoulders and one at his legs, and Sarah walked ahead of them toward the diner door. She was aware in a peripheral way of 70 people watching her. She was aware of Dale Hurst standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. She was aware that her heart was beating very fast and that her hands were steady. She pushed the door open and held it. Bring him in, she said. Dale and Priscilla left. Dale paid their bill. First, he set the money on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a man who wanted it on record that he had behaved correctly, and then he took Priscilla's elbow and guided her toward the door, pausing only to look back at Sarah with an expression that she couldn't quite read. Not anger, something more complicated than anger. This is a mistake, he said. Maybe, she said, but it's mine to make. The door swung shut behind them. Sarah turned back to the room. Ethan Cole was on the long booth seat along the far wall, wrapped in both blankets, his boots off and his feet elevated on a rolled jacket that someone had produced from somewhere. His color was already marginally better under the diner lights. His eyes were open and tracking, though he still had the loose, unfocused look of someone who wasn't entirely sure where he was. The rest of the men were still outside. The broad-shouldered man, the one who had been holding Ethan's head, the one who had spoken to her, was standing just inside the door, half in and half out, as if he hadn't fully committed to being inside yet. He was watching her with the same expression, that careful, neutral watchfulness. The rest of your people, she said, are they okay? Cold, he said. We've got people with medical conditions. One guy runs diabetic. One woman who's been riding for 12 hours. Woman, Sarah blinked. 3 women, he said, and for just a moment, something almost like amusement crossed his face. We're not all what you're picturing. I wasn't picturing anything, she said, which wasn't entirely true, and he probably knew it. My name is Jack Reynolds, he said. He didn't offer his hand, which she found oddly respectful under the circumstances. He was reading the room. She realized, reading her understanding, that she was already operating at the edge of her comfort zone and not wanting to push. I'm the chapter president. I make the decisions for this group. Sarah Mitchell, I own this place. I know, he said. Signs right there. She almost laughed. She didn't, but she almost did. Your people can come inside, she said, as long as we understand each other. What do we need to understand? That this is my place and my rules apply in here. I've got a daughter upstairs who is 8 years old and asleep. Nothing happens that I wouldn't want to happen with a child in the building. You understand that they're welcome. Jack Reynolds looked at her for a long moment. You have my word, he said. She didn't know him. She had no reason to trust his word. She had every reason that Dale Hurst and half of Garrison County would have recognized as legitimate to say thank you, but no. Good enough, she said. Tell them to come in. What happened next was something she would spend a long time trying to explain to people afterward, because people expected a particular story, and the particular story they expected was not the one that unfolded. They came in quietly. That was the first thing, 70 people filing into a diner that seated 45, and the dominant sound was boots on linoleum, and people saying, excuse me, and sorry, and careful with that. A man near the door caught a napkin dispenser that someone had accidentally knocked off a table and set it back without being asked. A woman with a long gray braid asked Sarah if there was anywhere she should put her wet outer layer. A young man with a beard and a split lip from where the cold wind had cracked his skin asked if he could use the restroom and said thank you twice when she pointed him toward the back. They filled every seat. They sat on the floor along the walls. They stood in the space between the counter and the kitchen door, careful not to block access. They were loud the way a large group of people is always loud, and all those voices layered over each other, but it was a warm kind of loud, a human kind of loud, the sound of people who had been cold and frightened and were now inside and were allowing themselves to feel the relief of that. Sarah stood behind the counter. She had exactly this 6 pounds of ground beef, 2 chickens she had planned to use for Thursday's special, a flat of eggs, 4 pounds of potatoes, a commercial-sized container of oatmeal, 12 cans of soup, half a bag of flour, a pound of butter, and approximately 8 pounds of coffee. She did the math in her head. It was not favorable math. Okay, she said to nobody in particular, and to everyone at the same time. I'm going to need some help. 3 hands went up before she finished the sentence. A man named Carl, who turned out to have spent 12 years as a short-order cook in Phoenix before life redirected him, came around behind the counter with a natural ease that told her he had stood in a kitchen like this 1,000 times. A woman named Rosie, mid-40s, sharp eyes and quick hands, started pulling down plates without being asked. A kid who couldn't have been older than 19 started rolling silverware and napkins at the end of the counter because he saw the bin of unrolled flatware and simply started doing it. You know, you don't have to, Sarah started. We're not helpless, Carl said pleasantly, already cracking eggs. And we ate your food supply just by walking in the door. Least we can do is help cook it. She didn't argue. An hour passed, maybe 2. The storm outside had settled into something serious. Not a blizzard exactly, but close enough that no one was going anywhere before morning. She had checked the highway conditions on her phone and confirmed what she suspected. Route 12 was closed in both directions, a jackknife semi 20 miles east and another one 6 miles west. There was nowhere to go. The diner had become something she didn't have a word for. It was too crowded to be comfortable and too warm to mind. People were talking. Not to her necessarily, not at first to each other, the comfortable, easy talk of people who knew each other well, the shorthand and the laughter and the running jokes that develop between people who spend a lot of time together. But gradually, inevitably, the way it happens in small spaces when people can't avoid each other, the conversation began to include her. Jack Reynolds sat at the counter. She had noticed he had not eaten. He had taken coffee and he had sat at the counter where he could see both the room and the door, which she recognized as the strategic positioning of someone who was used to being responsible for everyone else. He watched the room the way she watched her diner, with a kind of continuous low-grade vigilance that never fully relaxed. Your friend is better, she said, nodding toward the booth where Ethan Cole had graduated from lying down to sitting up, currently accepting a bowl of oatmeal from Rosie, with the sheepish gratitude of someone who was embarrassed about the fuss. Another hour in the cold, though. I know, Jack said. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. I should have pulled over sooner. He didn't tell me he was struggling. He's young, she said. Young and stubborn, Jack said. Nada, which is the most dangerous combination there is. Yeah, she refilled his coffee without being asked. I've got one of those upstairs. He glanced up. The daughter, Emma, 8 years old going on 45. She paused. She's going to be furious she slept through this. Something shifted in his expression again. Not dramatically, just a small loosening around the eyes. She sounds like a good kid. She's the best thing I ever did, Sarah said simply and without performance, the way people say things when they mean them completely. She moved down the counter to check on the coffee station, and when she came back, Jack was turned on the stool watching his people. She watched him watch them, the way his gaze moved from person to person, checking, assessing the particular attention of someone who knew every person in the room and was tracking all of them simultaneously. How long have you been doing this? She asked. Riding 28 years. Leading. He was quiet for a moment. You learn to lead when people keep looking to you for it, he said. Wasn't anything I sought out. I know that feeling, she said. He looked at her. You didn't want to own the diner, he said. It wasn't a question exactly. I wanted to keep it, she said. Those aren't the same thing. My father built it. He put 30 years into this place. He poured, she stopped, looked at her hands. He poured everything into it, his whole life. I wasn't going to let it just disappear. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. She said it flat, the way she said things she had said to herself so many times they had stopped being emotional and had become simply factual. Hard is when it matters. Jack Reynolds nodded. He didn't say anything else for a moment, just nodded and looked at his coffee, and She had the distinct impression that something she had said had landed somewhere specific in him, though she couldn't have said where or why. It was past midnight when Ethan Cole made it to the counter. He moved carefully the way people move when they've been reminded that their body has limits and they're still respecting that lesson. He sat on the stool next to Jack, and for a moment the two of them just sat there in the way of people who have known each other long enough that silence between them is comfortable. Ethan was Sarah realized now that she could see him properly, maybe 22, maybe 23. He had the kind of face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to look like, yet still some softness around the jaw, still something unresolved in his eyes, like a sentence that hadn't found its ending. He looked up at her. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words. Very simple. But the way he said them with a directness that felt practiced, like someone had told him once that if you were going to say thank you, you should look the person in the eye and mean it, hit her somewhere unexpected. "You're welcome," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said, "about how I was feeling. I didn't want to slow everybody down." "You nearly froze to death," she said, not unkindly. "Yeah." He looked down at the counter. "Jack's been on me about that, about letting people know when I need something." A pause. "I'm not real good at that." "Most people aren't," she said. "I kept thinking." He stopped, started again. "I kept thinking I could push through it, that it would get better, that I didn't need to be the guy who had to stop." Sarah Mitchell put a cup of hot tea in front of him. Not coffee. She'd noticed he hadn't touched the coffee, and she'd filed that away the way she filed everything. "The strongest thing you can do," she said, "is let someone help you." He looked up at her. There was something in his expression she recognized, though she couldn't have named it precisely the expression of someone hearing something they needed to hear in the particular moment they needed to hear it. Jack, to his credit, said absolutely nothing. At 1:15 in the morning, a man named Dennis, who had been sitting quietly in the corner booth doing something on his phone, came to the counter with an expression that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, "I'm sorry to bother you with this, but I've been trying to find local hotels or motels." He stopped. "There's nothing. Everything from here to Butte is full." "Because of the storm," she said. "Because of the storm," he confirmed. "And he glanced toward Jack with an expression that seemed to be asking for permission to continue, and Jack gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We have people here who are in bad shape. Margaret, the woman by the window, she has a heart condition. We have the guy with diabetes who needs to stay warm and eat regularly. We have people who've been on the road for 14 hours. We can't sleep outside in this." Sarah looked at the room, at the faces she had been cataloging all night, not deliberately, but the way you catalog things when they are in front of you and you are paying attention. The woman with the heart condition who had been quiet all night and whose color had been worrying Sarah for the past hour. The man with the diabetes, Dale, not the Dale she knew, but a different Dale, bearded and soft-spoken, who had been checking his blood sugar with the methodical regularity of someone who had learned not to take it for granted. The younger riders who were fighting to stay awake. The older ones who had stopped fighting. She thought about the 30 days. She thought about the 7 days left. She thought about the math she couldn't make work no matter how many times she ran it. She thought about Emma upstairs. She thought about her father. She thought about what he had always said, which was not a complicated thing, but which she had heard often enough that it had become the background noise of her conscience. A diner is just a building. What you do in it is what matters. She picked up the phone and called her neighbor Carol Stacks, who had a storage unit behind her house where Sarah kept the extra folding cots from the days when her father had sometimes sheltered stranded travelers during bad storms. Sarah had maintained the habit more out of sentiment than expectation. She had never actually needed to use them. Carol answered on the 4th ring, groggy and irritable, and then less irritable when Sarah explained the situation, and then because Carol Stacks was under her irritability, a genuinely good person agreed to bring the cots over. "How many do you have?" Dennis asked. 12, she said. "Not enough, but it's a start." He stopped, swallowed. "It's more than we had 20 minutes ago." She looked at him. He was older than he had seemed from a distance, mid-50s maybe, with a kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and kept the evidence. He had kind eyes. She hadn't expected that, and then she was vaguely ashamed of herself for not expecting it. Are you the one that handles logistics? She asked. Usually, he said. Okay, Dennis, I need you to do three things. First, figure out who most needs a flat surface to sleep on and make sure they get the cots. Second, find out if anyone here knows anything about a heating duct, because there's been a rattle in the one on the east wall for 6 months and I've never had the money to fix it. Third, she paused. Can anyone here cook breakfast? Because we're going to run out of the interesting stuff by 2 in the morning, and by 6 a.m. people are going to be hungry, and I've got oatmeal and eggs, and that's about it. Dennis stared at her. Then he smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that moved his whole face. Miss Mitchell, he said, I think we can manage that. It was somewhere around 3 in the morning. The diner quieter now. Many of the riders asleep in the booths or on the floor, or on the 12 cots that Carol had brought over. With a slightly wild look in her eyes, that Jack Reynolds came to stand beside Sarah, where she was leaning against the counter, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold without her noticing. She was looking at the room, at all of these people, sleeping, breathing, present. She was thinking about the fact that 7 days from now, this room, this exact room, with the specific slant of light through the east window and the particular sound of the heating duct rattling on the wall, in the booth where she and Emma ate breakfast every Sunday morning, might not be hers anymore. You went quiet, Jack said. I go quiet sometimes. What are you thinking about? She considered not answering. Then she said, 7 days. He waited. The bank, she said. Foreclosure. I've been fighting it for months and I'm running out of ways to fight. She said it the way she said things to herself, without drama, without asking for anything, just stating the fact. 7 days before they can start the proceedings. Jack was quiet for a long moment. You opened your door to 70 strangers, he said. I did. With a foreclosure notice on your wall and your daughter upstairs. Yes. He looked at her, and in his expression she saw something that she had not seen from very many people since this whole crisis had begun. Not pity, not sympathy exactly, but a particular kind of recognition. The look of one person seeing another person clearly, without the softening that comes from distance or the distortion that comes from story. Why, he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to think about things when she bothered to think about them at all. Because that boy was on the ground, she said, and I knew how to help him. And everything else was just, she shook her head. Everything else was noise. Jack Reynolds set down his coffee cup. He looked at the room full of sleeping people at the 12 cots and the riders on the floor, and the boy named Ethan, who had almost been a tragedy and was now just asleep in a booth with his boots propped up and his color back. You know what I've learned, he said, in 28 years of writing? Tell me. That you can tell everything about a person, he said, by what they do when it costs them something. Sarah Mitchell held her cold coffee. She didn't say anything. Outside, the storm continued. The highway stayed closed. The night pressed down on Montana with all the weight it had. And inside a small diner on the edge of Route 1270, strangers breathed in the warmth of a woman who had chosen when it cost her something to open the door. The morning came the way mornings do, after long, difficult nights, not with drama, but with the ordinary cruelty of light. Gray first, then pale gold pressing in through the windows, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Sarah had not slept. She had sat at the counter through the last hours of the night, not because she couldn't have found somewhere to rest. There were chairs. There was the small office in the back with the old couch her father had never thrown out, but because she couldn't make herself leave the room. There was something happening in the diner that she didn't have a name for yet, something that felt fragile in the way that genuine things sometimes feel fragile. Like if she stopped paying attention, it might stop being real. By 5:30, people were beginning to stir. Not loudly, not all at once. The way a room full of people wakes up when they are guests somewhere and they know it cautiously with an awareness of taking up space. She heard the rustle of someone sitting up from the floor, the low sound of a whispered conversation from the corner booth, someone moving quietly toward the bathroom, the small, careful sounds of people being considerate. Carl was the first one in the kitchen. He appeared at her elbow with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years learning not to make a production of things and said simply, "Coffee first, then we figure out breakfast. You got eggs?" 2 dozen, she said. Potatoes. About 4 pounds. He nodded already, tying on the spare apron she kept on the hook by the kitchen door. I can stretch that. What about oatmeal? Half a tub. Okay. He looked at the room at the 70-odd people beginning to blink themselves awake and did the same math she had done the night before, arrived at the same unfavorable answer, and then set his jaw and went into the kitchen because the math was the math and breakfast still had to happen. Sarah pushed herself off the counter and began making coffee. Her hands moved through the familiar sequence without her having to think about it. The scoops, the water, the filter, the timing, and the smell that rose up from the machine as it started running was the smell of her entire life, the smell of every morning she had ever had in this building, and she let herself be inside it for just a moment before the day started asking things of her. Jack Reynolds was awake. She wasn't surprised. She had a feeling he was the kind of man who was always awake before the room was. He had moved from the counter to a spot by the door, standing with his arms crossed, watching people wake up. Not supervising exactly, just present, available. He came to the counter when she set a fresh cup in front of the space where he'd been sitting. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Same as last night," she said. "You reckon better when there's coffee." She poured it. He took it. They stood in the comfortable, slightly tired silence of people who have gotten through a long night together. "Your daughter's still asleep?" he asked. "Probably not for much longer," Sarah said. "She's a light sleeper. The moment people start moving around down here, she'll be up." "You want me to?" He paused. "Is there anything I should tell the guys about how to act when she comes down?" Sarah looked at him. The question surprised her, and then it didn't. "Just be yourselves," she said. "Whatever that is. She doesn't scare easy. Like her mother." "Worse," Sarah said, and this time she did almost smile. Yeah. Emma Mitchell came downstairs at 6:14. Sarah heard her before she saw her, the specific sound of Emma's footsteps on the stairs, which had a pattern entirely her own, heavy on the left foot and quick on the right, the result of an old habit of skipping the third step, which squeaked. The footsteps paused at the bottom of the stairwell. Then Emma appeared in the doorway. She was in her pajamas, blue flannel with small yellow stars. Her dark hair was doing the complicated thing it always did overnight. Part of it twisted over one shoulder and the rest pointed in a direction that had nothing to do with gravity. She had her mother's eyes the same specific shade that wasn't quite green and wasn't quite brown, the color of creek water in October. And she was using them right now to look at the room full of large strangers with an expression that was above all else interested, not scared, interested. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when a child enters unexpectedly. A dozen conversations paused. People who had been eating looked up. Rosie, who had been refilling coffee, stopped moving. Emma looked at the room, then she looked at her mother. "Mom," she said, "why is our diner full of bikers?" Sarah heard at least 3 people fail to suppress a laugh. "There was a storm last night," Sarah said. "They needed somewhere to stay." Emma considered this for approximately 3 seconds in the way that 8-year-olds consider things quickly, practically, and without the layers of anxiety that adults bring to identical situations. "Okay," she said. "Did they eat all the pancake mix?" "We don't have pancake mix." "We did yesterday. I used it Wednesday." Emma processed this. "Did they at least eat well?" "We managed." Emma looked at the room again, and then without further ceremony walked to the counter, climbed onto the stool beside Jack Reynolds and said, "Hi, I'm Emma. Are you the boss of all these people?" Jack Reynolds, who had ridden with the Hells Angels for 28 years and had, by Sarah's estimate, faced situations that would unmoor most people, looked at this 8-year-old girl in her star pajamas, and something happened to his expression that she hadn't seen happen before. Something simplified, cleared. "Something like that," he said. "Do you want some coffee?" Emma said. "I know how to make it. Mom taught me." "I've got coffee," he said. "Thank you." "Are you hungry? Carl is making eggs." "He's pretty good. Better than Mom, actually." She said this last part loudly enough that it was clearly intended for Sarah to hear. "I heard that," Sarah said. "It's true, though," Emma said without guilt. She swiveled on the stool to look at the room more fully. "Is that man okay?" she said, pointing directly at Ethan Cole, who was awake now and sitting at the booth, still pale around the edges, still wearing the look of someone whose body had recently issued a serious complaint. "He's better than he was," Jack said. "He was sick, too cold." "His lips are still kind of purple," Emma said. "Emma," Sarah said. "They are, though. They're better than they were, Ethan called from the booth in a voice that was still slightly rough, but warm enough to carry. And you can see them from all the way over there. I have very good eyes, Emma said. Ethan Cole, who had almost died the night before, laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that belongs to a body that has just remembered it's alive and is choosing to celebrate that. The room relaxed. Sarah watched it happen, watched the residual tension that had been sitting under the surface of everything. Even in the warmth of the night, even in the goodwill that had built up over hours of shared food and shared space, she watched it dissolve quietly and completely in the 60 seconds following her 8-year-old daughter's arrival. She thought about what Jack had said the night before. You can tell everything about a person by what they do when it costs them something. She thought he might have also said something about children if he'd thought of it, about how children see without the architecture of assumption, about how an 8-year-old in star pajamas asking a biker if he wanted coffee could accomplish something that hours of cautious adult goodwill sometimes couldn't. She picked up the coffee pot and went back to work. So, the first call came at 7:43. She knew the number before she answered. Garrison, Montana is a small place, and the particular digital signature of Donna Caverly's landline was not something she could mistake. Donna was 62, had lived in the same house 3 miles from the diner for 40 years, was the informal information hub for a 10-mile radius, and was currently calling at 7:43 in the morning, which meant she already knew. Sarah. Not a question, a statement, an accusation in one word. Donna, Sarah said, stepping into the back hall where it was marginally quieter. I'm hearing things. About, don't play dumb with me. Dale Hurst called me at midnight to tell me you let 70 Hells Angels sleep in your diner. That's accurate. A pause that communicated several things simultaneously. Sarah Louise Mitchell, Donna said. Don't middle name me Donna. What were you thinking? I was thinking there was a kid collapsed in my parking lot and it was 12 degrees and I had blankets. You could have called the sheriff. In 35 minutes, that boy might have been in serious trouble. The sheriff in 35 minutes doesn't help that. Those people are dangerous. Those people, Sarah said, with a precision and a firmness that she didn't bother to soften, helped me cook breakfast for 70. They carried their own trash. They fixed the rattling in my heating duct that I've been living with for 6 months. So far, Donna, the most dangerous thing in the room is the coffee, which Carl makes significantly stronger than I do. Another pause. Different quality. Someone fixed your heat. Man named Dennis. 20 minutes with a screwdriver. Turns out it was just a loose bracket. She paused. Which would have been nice to know 6 months ago. Sarah, Donna's voice had shifted slightly. People are worried. I've had 3 calls this morning already. About what exactly are you sure? About you, about Emma, about whether you know what you've gotten yourself into. Sarah leaned against the wall. She was tired. The specific crystalline tiredness that comes from no sleep and full focus, that combination, that has no softness in it at all. Tell them Emma is fine, she said. Tell them the diner is fine. Tell them if they want to do something useful, they could come over and have breakfast because we could use the business. Donna was quiet for a long moment. You're not going to be talked out of this, Donna said. It was not entirely a complaint. I was never in a position to be talked out of it, Sarah said. It already happened. Now I'm making it work. She went back into the diner. The second call came 11 minutes later, and this one was worse. This one was the bank, not her regular contact, not Linda Marsh, who had the professional courtesy to be uncomfortable when she delivered bad news, but someone from a different department, a man named Garrett, who spoke with the particular toneless efficiency of someone who dealt in numbers and preferred not to think too hard about what the numbers represented. Ms. Mitchell, I'm calling as a follow-up to our communication of the 14th regarding the foreclosure timeline. I know what the timeline is, she said. She was in the back office, now the door pulled, mostly shut, voice low. We've had a development. The restructuring proposal you submitted has been reviewed and unfortunately does not meet the criteria for what criteria? A pause. The income projections in your proposal do not reflect the current revenue reality of the property based on the last 6 months of. The last 6 months included a month where I lost my furnace in October and had to close for 2 weeks. Her voice was level. She had practiced being level about this. And a month in August where Route 12 was under construction and we had 30% of our normal traffic. Ms. Mitchell. Those are anomalies, not trend lines. The bank's assessment, what would it take, she said, specifically. What number and what time frame would change the bank's assessment? The man on the other end of the phone was quiet in the way of someone consulting something. Papers, a screen, a policy manual. He probably didn't need to consult, but was consulting for the purpose of delay. A demonstrated increase in revenue over the next 30-day period, alongside a cosigner for a restructured loan agreement alongside it. I don't have a cosigner, she said. Then the timeline remains as stated, he said. We will be in contact regarding next steps. The call ended. She sat in the back office with the phone in her hand. 7 days had become 6. She had no cosigner. She had no demonstrated revenue increase. She had a diner full of bikers who had eaten most of her food supply in a storm that had prevented regular customers from coming in, which meant last night had been, from a strictly financial perspective, one of the most expensive nights she had had in months. She sat with that for exactly 90 seconds. Then she stood up, put the phone in her pocket, and went back out to the counter. Carl was plating eggs. Rosie was pouring coffee. Emma was sitting at the far end of the counter with her math workbook, which she had brought down from upstairs because it was a school day, and Sarah had taught her that a school day was a school day regardless of what was happening around it. Ethan Cole was sitting 2 stools away from Emma watching her work, and had apparently asked what she was doing because Emma was now explaining long division in the particular manner of a child who has recently achieved competence at something and is eager to demonstrate it. Jack Reynolds was watching all of this from his position by the door. He looked at Sarah when she came out. She knew her face was doing something she hadn't intended it to do. She had always been bad at making her face behave. He didn't say anything. He just held her gaze for a moment with that careful, clear attention of his, and then he looked away, and she understood that he had filed what he saw and would come back to it when the timing was right. The news arrived in the diner at 8:53, and it arrived in the form of Tommy Reyes, who was 16, worked weekends for Sarah bussing tables, and had apparently ridden his bicycle through the aftermath of the storm past the downed branches and the ice patches and the general post-storm debris because he had something to show her. He came in, breathless and cold, shook snow from his jacket, and held up his phone. Ms. Mitchell, he said, you're on the internet. She stared at him. What? Facebook? Someone posted about last night, about you letting all the... He glanced at the room, recalibrated. About last night, and it got shared. A lot. How much is a lot? He looked at the phone, looked back at her. It's at like 4,000 shares right now, and there's a news station in Billings asking. No, she said immediately. Miss Mitchell, no news stations, no cameras, no interviews. She said it cleanly and without hesitation. These people came here because they needed help not to be a story. That's not mine to give away. Tommy blinked. Okay, but the comments, Tommy, they're really nice, he said. Like really, really nice. People are saying they want to come, like to the diner. People from Billings, from Great Falls. Someone from Missoula. She went still. He showed her the phone. The post was not from anyone she knew. It was from someone who had driven past on the highway that morning and seen the parking lot full of motorcycles and had stopped to ask what had happened and had gotten the story from Dennis, who had told it with the particular restrained accuracy of a man who respected other people's stories. The post was 3 paragraphs. It said that a single mother in Montana had opened her diner to 70 stranded Hells Angels in a storm, that she had fed them with the last of her food, that they had in turn fixed her heating duct, cleaned her tables, and taken care of each other with a care and consideration that the person writing the post called in plain language beautiful. 4,000 shares and climbing. She handed the phone back to Tommy. She turned around to find Jack Reynolds standing 2 feet behind her. I didn't, she started. Dennis, he said, it wasn't an accusation. He talks to people. It's part of his nature. I'll speak to him. No, she said. Then more quietly, no, don't. It's what he said was true, wasn't it? Yes. Then I can't be angry about true things, she said. I don't want it to turn into something other than what it was. What was it? She thought about it honestly, the way she always did. It was just people, she said, helping each other. That's all. Jack Reynolds looked at her with that expression she'd been seeing on his face at intervals all night, the one she still didn't have a name for. Yeah, he said, that's all it ever is. The storm had passed by 9 in the morning, and Route 12 was cleared by 10, and by 10:30, the Hells Angels were preparing to leave. It happened gradually and then quickly the way departures do. People checking their bikes, gathering their things, pulling on jackets and gloves with the particular purposefulness of people resuming interrupted business. The diner, which had been full and warm and complicated all night, began to empty out, and each person who left seemed to take a specific quality of the air with them, and the room became more and more itself again, familiar quiet the size it actually was. Most of them stopped to thank her on the way out, not in a performative way, not with speeches, in the plain direct way of people who mean what they say and say only what they mean. A handshake, a nod. Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. Take care of yourself. Good coffee. The woman with the heart condition, whose name was Margaret Oakes, and who looked considerably better than she had the night before, took Sarah's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment without saying anything, which said more than most things said with words. Rosie, the woman who had pulled down plates the night before and refilled coffee and moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd spent her life in similar places, stopped in front of Sarah with her helmet in her hand. This place is special, she said. You know that, right? It's my dad's diner, Sarah said. No, Rosie said. It's yours. It's yours because of what you did in it. Your dad built the building. You built what happens here. She put her helmet on. Don't let anyone take that. She was outside before Sarah could answer. Ethan Cole was last besides Jack. He came to the counter with his jacket fully on and his color fully back and something different in his face than the boy she had pulled off the ground in the parking lot. Something more settled, more present. He stood in front of her counter and looked at her with that direct look she'd noticed the night before. I want to say something, he said. Say it. I've been going through a rough time. Before this trip, I mean. For a while. He said it the way young men say difficult things, when they are just learning that saying difficult things is allowed carefully, precisely leaving nothing extra in the sentence. And I was writing because it was the only thing that felt like moving forward. And last night He stopped. Last night I thought I was going to die in a parking lot in Montana. You were not going to die, Sarah said firmly. I was in the direction of it, he said, which was honest, and she couldn't argue it. And when you came out, when you just walked out there with your blankets and your first aid kit, and you didn't hesitate, I don't know. Something happened. What happened? He thought about it. I stopped feeling like I was invisible, he said. Does that make sense? Sarah Mitchell looked at this 22-year-old boy who had almost been a tragedy and had become somewhere over the course of one long winter night, something she didn't have a word for yet. It makes complete sense, she said. He nodded, looked at the counter, looked back up. I hope the thing with the bank works out, he said. She went still. Who told you? Nobody told me anything, he said. I heard you in the back earlier. I wasn't trying to listen. He paused. I'm sorry. She exhaled. It's okay. I mean it, he said. I hope it works out, because this place... He looked at the room at the counter and the booths and the window and the specific quality of the light that was just her diner being her diner on a winter morning. This place deserves to stay. He walked out. Jack Reynolds was the last one. He stood at the door with his jacket on and his helmet in his hand, and he looked at her across the length of the now quiet diner, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. There was a quality to the silence that she noticed. Not awkward, not empty. The kind of silence that exists between people who have shared something real and haven't agreed yet on what to do with it. I want to ask you something, he said, and you can tell me it's none of my business. Ask. How much time do you actually have? She didn't pretend she didn't know what he meant. 7 days, she said, before the next stage of the process. And I need a co-signer and a revenue bump and a restructured loan agreement, and I have approximately none of those things. He absorbed this without visible reaction. Not because he didn't have one, she was learning to read the small things in his face, the slight tension around the jaw, the way his eyes moved when he was processing something that mattered. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. We'll be in touch, he said. Jack, she stopped. I don't want charity. I need you to know that. He looked at her steadily. "Sarah," he said, "the worst thing you ever assumed about us was that we might be dangerous, and you opened the door anyway." He held her gaze. "The least insulting thing you could do is assume the best about why I just said we'll be in touch." She didn't have an answer for that. He put his helmet on. "Take care of your daughter," he said through the visor. Then he was out the door, and the sound of 70 motorcycles starting was the sound of something ending, and Sarah stood at her window and watched them go until Route 12 was empty in both directions, and the only sound left was the heating duct on the east wall, which was not rattling anymore, and the coffee maker finishing its cycle, and Emma in the kitchen asking Carl if there were any eggs left. Sarah put her hand flat on the counter. Her father's counter. Her counter. 7 days. She took a breath. Then she went to answer Emma. Door. The call started at noon, not one or two, not a handful. She started counting at 14 and stopped at 30 because the phone would not stop ringing, and she had tables to tend to, which she needed, because for the first time in a month there were tables that needed tending. They came because of the Post, which had moved from 4,000 shares to 11,000, sometime between breakfast and lunch, and was apparently still moving. They came from Garrison and from Butte and from Helena and from Billings and from places further than that, people who had seen the story on Facebook and had decided that the diner on Route 12 was somewhere they wanted to be. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't arrive in a group or get signings or with any of the organized quality of something planned. They just appeared, one car after another, pulling into the gravel lot that the bikers had left, and ordering coffee and breakfast and lunch and sitting in the booths that still held the warmth of 70 people who had needed somewhere to be. By 2 in the afternoon, Sarah had called Tommy Reyes back in, and Carol Stacks had shown up entirely uninvited with an apron on and a look that dared Sarah to tell her to leave, and her friend Janet from the gas station down the road had closed up early and was bussing tables with the focused energy of someone with a purpose. Sarah stood behind the counter and ran the tickets and watched the room fill and empty and fill again. She thought about Jack Reynolds. We'll be in touch. She thought about Ethan Cole. This place deserves to stay. She thought about her father who had built this counter and sat behind it for 30 years, who had made coffee for truck drivers and farmers and travelers, who had believed in a simple and unsentimental way that a person's job was to make the people in front of them feel that they were welcome and that their hunger would be addressed and that the world for the duration of a cup of coffee was not unkind. She thought about the bank and the 7 days and the math that still didn't work and the cosigner she didn't have and the revenue increase that a good lunch crowd, even a great lunch crowd, could not manufacture in a week. She thought about all of it, and then she picked up the coffee pot and she started pouring because there were people at the counter and they had driven a long way to be here. And the least she could do, the least anyone could do, was make sure the coffee was hot. The door opened again. Another car. Another family stamping snow from their boots in her doorway, looking around at the warm, full room with that particular expression people wear when they find exactly what they were looking for. The mother looked at Sarah and said, "Is there room?" Sarah Mitchell looked at the room. Then she looked back. "There's always room," she said, and she meant it in more ways than one. 3 days after the storm, Sarah Mitchell woke up at 5 in the morning to the sound of trucks. Not one truck, multiple trucks. The kind of heavy diesel sound that she associated with deliveries and construction and things happening on a scale larger than one person had planned for. She lay in bed for exactly 4 seconds, telling herself she was still half asleep and misinterpreting what she was hearing, and then she got up. She didn't bother with shoes. She went down the stairs in her socks through the dark diner to the front window, and she looked out. There were 3 trucks in her parking lot, and behind the trucks, motorcycles. Not 70 this time. More. Maybe more than 70. She couldn't count them in the early morning dark, but the lot was full, and the overflow had spilled onto the gravel shoulder of Route 12, bikes lined up in a row that extended further than she could see. And there were people, moving around in the organized, purposeful way of people who had been given a task and understood it and were proceeding without needing to be told again. Men pulling equipment from the backs of trucks, women with clipboards and tool belts, someone with a generator that fired to life with a sound that rattled her front window. Her phone rang. She already knew. "Jack," she said. "Good morning," he said. "Sorry about the noise." "What is happening in my parking lot?" I told you we'd be in touch. You said that 3 days ago. It took 3 days to get organized, he said, and his voice carried the particular quality of someone who had spent those 3 days being extremely organized and was finding it somewhat satisfying that the results were now visible. Are you going to come outside? I'm in my socks, she said. Put shoes on, he said. There's someone I want you to meet. She stood at the window for another moment, watching the organized motion of people in her parking lot, people who had driven. She didn't know how far yet, but far before dawn, because Jack Reynolds had apparently made a phone call, or several phone calls or something she didn't yet fully understand. She put her shoes on. She went outside. The cold hit her the same way it had 3 nights ago, direct and unapologetic. But this time the sky was clear, and the early light had the specific quality of Montana winter mornings, clean and sharp, and without any of the softness that other climates offer. She stood on the top step and looked at what had assembled itself in her parking lot while she was sleeping. Jack came to her immediately. Beside him was a woman she hadn't seen before, mid-50s, compact with close-cropped silver hair, in the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of standing in rooms where people tried to make her feel smaller than she was and failing to accomplish it. She was carrying a leather folio the way a person carries something they use. Sarah Mitchell, Jack said, this is Helen Carr. She's an attorney. Helen Carr put out her hand and Sarah shook it. The handshake was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who didn't use it as a performance. I've looked at your situation, Helen said without preamble. Jack sent me the documentation 3 days ago. I've reviewed the loan origination, the bank's communications, and the foreclosure timeline. Sarah stared at her. 3 days ago, Jack had none of that documentation. No, Helen said, but Dennis did. Sarah turned to look at Jack. Jack looked back at her with an expression that was not quite apologetic and not quite not apologetic. Dennis, she said. Dennis, Jack confirmed. He noticed the foreclosure notice on the board in your back office when he was working on the heating duct. He photographed it. He sent it to me. I sent it to Helen. He paused. I was going to tell you. You were going to tell me after you'd already handled it, she said. I was going to tell you when I had something to tell you. She absorbed this. The part of her that was proud and had been proud her entire life and had built that pride into something structural, something she leaned on, wanted to object. The part of her that had not slept enough in 3 days and had 4 days, now before the bank's timeline advance, wanted to let it go. She let it go. What did you find? She said to Helen. Helen opened the folio. 3 things, she said. First, the bank failed to notify you of a federally available loan modification program for small businesses that you would have qualified for. They are required under the terms of your original loan agreement to inform you of such programs. They did not. Second, one of the 2 outstanding loans against the property was co-signed by your father and a business partner whose signature upon examination appears to be inconsistent with other documented signatures from the same period. We're looking into whether that co-signature was obtained legitimately. She paused. Third, the 60-day foreclosure timeline they cited does not begin on the date they told you it began. Under Montana state law, the computation of the notice period for residential adjacent commercial properties starts from the date of recorded filing, not the date of the letter. Their letter was dated 5 days after the recorded filing. Sarah was very still. What does that mean? She said. Specifically, what does it mean for me? It means you have at minimum 12 additional days beyond what they told you, Helen said. Possibly more depending on what we find with the co-signature. She looked at Sarah directly. It also means the bank has been, whether intentionally or through negligence, providing you with incorrect information about your legal situation, which gives us grounds to challenge the timeline, to demand the modification program be offered retroactively, and to file a complaint with the state banking division. Sarah put her hand on the step railing. Not because she needed support, because she needed something physical to confirm that she was standing where she thought she was standing and hearing what she thought she was hearing. Helen, she said, how much would this cost me? Helen Carr looked at her steadily. Nothing, she said. I don't want charity. It's not charity, Helen said. I'm taking this pro bono because the bank made errors that I find professionally offensive. She paused. Also because Jack asked me to, and I've known Jack Reynolds for 15 years. And when he asks me something, it's because it matters. Another pause. And because you opened your door, and I think that deserves a door being opened for you. Sarah looked at Jack. Jack looked at a point somewhere above her left shoulder, which was the look of a man who had done something and would accept the result, but was not going to stand in the middle of it and be thanked. The trucks, Sarah said. What's in the trucks? Materials, he said. For what? He turned to look at her building. She had learned in the past 3 days that when Jack Reynolds looked at something directly, it was because he was telling her to look at it too. She looked at her building. She saw it the way she always saw it, with the familiarity that makes you stop noticing things. The roof where 2 shingles had been slightly lifted by last spring's wind, the east-facing window that had been slowly developing a crack in the lower corner for 2 years, the front steps where the railing wobbled on the left side, the sign above the door, where 2 of the letters had faded to the point of being readable only if you already knew what they said. She had stopped seeing all of it. It was just the building, her problem, her accumulation of deferred repairs and not enough money and not enough time. Jack, she said quietly. There are 12 contractors, he said. 3 licensed electricians, 2 plumbers, a roofer who says the shingles on the east face are 1 bad winter away from a real problem. Dennis organized the materials list. A man named Garrett Foyle, he's a chapter member in Missoula. He owns a construction supply company. He's covering the materials at cost. He paused. We've got today and tomorrow and the day after. That's not enough time to do all of it, no, he said. To do what's critical and what's safe and what gives this building another 10 years without falling apart. Yes, that's enough time for that. She was very quiet. Around her in her parking lot, people continued working with the calm and organized energy of people who had been told what to do and had decided to do it fully. She heard the sounds of equipment, of voices, coordinating, of things beginning. She heard her own heartbeat, which was doing something complicated. Why, she said, the same question he had asked her 3 nights ago. He looked at her. Because you helped us when we had nowhere to go, he said, and because this building is worth saving, and because, he stopped, started again, because people look at us and they decide who we are before we say a word. And you didn't do that. You just saw people who needed to come inside. He held her gaze. That's rarer than you think. We don't forget it. Sarah Mitchell stood on her front step in the early morning cold and looked at the people in her parking lot and did not cry, which required a specific and conscious effort that she was proud of afterward. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. But I'm feeding everyone. That's not negotiable. For the first time since she had met him, Jack Reynolds smiled fully without reservation. We were counting on that, he said. Zamek. By 7 in the morning, her diner was running at full capacity, and the parking lot had become a construction zone of focused, competent activity, and Emma had come downstairs, assessed the situation with the speed that was becoming her established characteristic, and immediately appointed herself in charge of carrying water bottles to workers. Nobody questioned this arrangement. Emma had that quality. Sarah worked the counter and watched her building get attention. It had needed for years and could not quite process what was happening without her brain skipping off the surface of it like a stone off water. The town noticed by 8. The first person to say something she hadn't expected was Dale Hurst. Dale Hurst, who had warned her to lock the door. Dale Hurst, who had put his money on the counter with deliberate correctness and guided his wife out with his arms crossed and told her on his way out that she was making a mistake. Dale Hurst pulled into the parking lot at 8:15, sat in his truck. For a full 2 minutes, she could see him from the counter window, sitting very still, the way a person sits when they are revising something, and then got out. He came inside. He sat at the counter. He ordered coffee, which she poured. He sat with the coffee for a moment. I owe you an apology, he said. Sarah looked at him. I wasn't wrong to be cautious, he said. I want to be clear about that. I was not wrong to be cautious. Okay, she said, but I was wrong about them. He said it with the specific difficulty of a man who valued being right and was choosing honesty anyway. I can see that now. What's happening out there? He nodded toward the window, toward the sounds of work. That's not what I expected. What did you expect? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said. Nothing good. He looked at his coffee. That's the honest answer. I expected nothing good and I was wrong. She refilled his coffee, though it didn't need refilling yet. You know what my father always said, she said. What? He said the worst thing a person can do is make up their mind before the evidence comes in. She set the pot down. He also said the second worst thing is refusing to change your mind when it does. Dale Hurst nodded slowly. He was a smart man, he said. He was, she agreed. Dale finished his coffee. He left a 20 on the counter for a $2 cup, which was not an accident, and they both knew it. On his way to the door, he stopped, looked out the window at the work happening in the lot, and stood there for a long moment. Then he turned around. I've got a truck in 3 hours, he said. And my nephew does drywall. Is there something we can do? Sarah Mitchell looked at Dale Hurst. Go talk to the man named Dennis, she said. He'll know where to put you. Dale went outside. Sarah watched him cross the parking lot, watched him approach Dennis with the careful, slightly stiff body language of a man bridging a gap he had helped create. Watched Dennis look at him and nod and point towards something beyond the building. Watched Dale nod back and follow. She turned back to the counter. Tommy Reyes was watching from the end of the service window. Did Dale Hurst just volunteer, he said. He did, Sarah said. Tommy processed this. Huh, he said, and went back to bussing tables. The twist that Sarah Mitchell had not seen coming arrived at 9:47 in the morning, and it arrived in the form of a phone call from a number she didn't recognize with a 406 area code Montana, and a woman's voice on the other end who identified herself as Patricia Kim from the Billings Gazette. Ms. Mitchell, I apologize for contacting you directly. I understand you declined to speak to media previously. I did, Sarah said. She was in the back hall again, the counter noise behind her. I'm going to decline again. I understand, Patricia Kim said, but I'm not calling for the story you think I'm calling for. What story do you think I think you're calling for? The human interest story, the single mom and the bikers. We have that story. Multiple sources gave it to us. What I'm calling about is different. A pause. Ms. Mitchell, are you aware that the regional vice president of the bank holding your loan is currently under investigation by the Montana Division of Banking and Financial Institutions? Sarah stopped moving. I was not aware of that, she said carefully. The investigation opened 6 weeks ago. It involves a pattern of foreclosure proceedings against small businesses in the Route 12 corridor. There are 4 other businesses in the same situation as yours, all within 40 miles, all with the same loan officer, all given the same incorrect information about their foreclosure timelines. Patricia Kim's voice was precise and even, the voice of someone who had done the research and was confident in it. I've been working on this story for 2 months. When your name came up on the social media posts and I cross-referenced it with the businesses in my research. She paused. You're not an isolated case, Ms. Mitchell. You're a pattern. The back hall was very quiet. Why are you telling me this? Sarah said. Because you deserve to know, Patricia Kim said. And because your attorney, Helen Carr, is apparently already filing paperwork this morning, and I thought you should understand the full scope of what she might be walking into. You know, Helen Carr has been trying to get someone to pay attention to this for 6 weeks, Patricia Kim said. Apparently what she needed was a viral Facebook post about a biker diner to make people look in the right direction. Sarah sat down on the floor of the back hall. Not dramatically. Her knees simply decided that this was a reasonable time to be on the floor, and she let them. Ms. Mitchell, Patricia Kim's voice through the phone. Are you still there? I'm here, she said. I'm sitting on the floor. A beat. That seems reasonable, Patricia Kim said. The other businesses, Sarah said. The other 4. Are they still in their timelines, Patricia Kim said. 2 of them were told they had less time than they actually have, same as you. One of them has already signed a deed in lieu of foreclosure that may be challengeable if the investigation finds what I think it's going to find. Who are they? I can't share that yet. But if you're willing to speak with me, not for a human interest story, for an investigative piece, the visibility could help all 5 of you. Sarah sat on the floor of her back hall and listened to the sound of work happening on her building and the sound of her diner running and the specific distant sound of Emma's voice explaining something to someone with great seriousness and authority. Let me call you back, she said. She hung up. She sat there for 60 seconds. Then she stood up and went to find Jack. She found him outside in conversation with the roofer, a heavy-set man named Phil who was gesturing at the east face of the roof with the frustrated affection of a person who loves buildings and is pained by their neglect. She waited until Phil had finished his point, and then she said, "Jack, I need a minute." He followed her to the side of the building. She told him everything. Patricia Kim, the investigation, the 5 businesses, the pattern. Helen already filing. She told it in the plain, direct way she told things when she had processed just enough to speak, but not enough to perform. Just the facts in order cleanly. Jack listened without interrupting. She was learning what he did. He listened the way very few people listened fully, without preparing his response, without nodding to signal he was following. He just received what she said. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Does Helen know?" he said. "Patricia Kim says Helen has been trying to get someone to pay attention for 6 weeks. So Helen knows." "Helen knows," she confirmed. He processed this with the particular expression of someone adding information to a picture that is becoming clearer. "Are you going to talk to the journalist?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "My first instinct is no. I don't want this to be a media circus. I don't want you and your people turned into props in someone's story. I told them no once already." "This is different," he said. "Is it? The first story is about a woman who did a kind thing, which is true and it's a good story, but it's yours to give or not give." He held her gaze. "This story is about a bank that has been doing something wrong to 5 families. That's not just yours." She looked at him. "If there are 4 other people in the same situation," he said, "and this story helps them," "I know," she said. "Then it's not about you anymore," he said. She already knew that. She had known it the second Patricia Kim said the word pattern. She had known it the way you know things that your pride hasn't caught up to yet. "I'll call her back," she said. "Good," he said. She turned to go back inside. He said her name and she turned around. "Sarah," he said. "Whatever happens with the bank, with the media, with all of it." He looked at her with a directness that she had come to understand was his version of being fully present. "You opened that door 3 nights ago. Everything that's happening right now is because of that. Don't let anyone reframe it as something else." She held that for a moment. "I opened the door because a kid was on the ground," she said. "I know," he said. "That's exactly what I mean." Jayam. Helen Carr arrived at the diner at 11 with an expression that Sarah had learned in the course of one morning meant she had been busy. She sat at the counter, she accepted coffee, she opened the folio. "I've been on the phone with the Montana Division of Banking since 7 this morning," she said. "The investigation Patricia Kim mentioned is real. My filing this morning is now part of a consolidated complaint involving 5 properties." She looked at Sarah. "The regional VP, a man named Garrett Pullman, has been identified as the common thread in all 5 cases. He's been accelerating foreclosure timelines on distressed small businesses, and the investigators believe facilitating the acquisition of those properties by a third-party LLC at below-market prices following foreclosure." The diner was loud and full around them. Sarah focused on Helen's voice. "He's been flipping foreclosed businesses," she said. "That's the working theory," Helen said, "with someone on the acquisition side who knew the properties were coming. It's fraud if they can prove it. Banking fraud and potentially wire fraud. Can they prove it? The investigators believe so. They've been building the case for 6 weeks." Helen's voice was precise and careful. The voice of someone who knows the difference between what she knows and what she suspects. What they needed was another case with clean documentation and a visible public profile to bring pressure. She paused. "Your Facebook post, as it turns out, created more visibility in 72 hours than 6 weeks of quiet investigation." Sarah put her hands flat on the counter. "My foreclosure," she said. "Is it? The banking division has issued a temporary hold on all 5 foreclosure proceedings pending the investigation," Helen said. "Effective this morning." The counter was solid under her hands. She focused on that. "A hold," she said. "Temporary," Helen said. But real. You're not in foreclosure proceedings today. And depending on how the investigation resolves," she paused. "For Sarah, if they prove what they think they can prove, the loans may be restructured under a remediation program, or canceled entirely depending on the degree of malfeasance." Sarah was very still. "Helen," she said, "what are you telling me?" Helen Carr looked at her with the directness of someone who had practiced delivering accurate information to people who needed it. "I'm telling you," she said, "that you might not lose this diner." The noise of the diner continued around her. Someone laughed at a table near the window. The coffee maker ran its cycle. She could hear faintly through the walls the sounds of work on the building. Phil on the roof, the electricians in the east wall, Dennis directing something in the parking lot, the particular sound of people doing things with their hands because they had decided to. She thought about the night of the storm, about the sound of 70 motorcycles going quiet in her parking lot, about a boy collapsing on the ground in the cold, about a door. About a door. She thought about her father saying a diner is just a building. What you do in it is what matters. About the sign he had considered putting over the entrance when he first opened and had never gotten around to it. Everyone deserves a place to stop. She thought about 4 other businesses on Route 12 who had been told lies about their timelines. 4 other people who had been counting down to a date that wasn't even real alone without a Helen car and without a Jack Reynolds and without 70 people in a parking lot making noise with tools. The other businesses, she said, the 4 others. Are they going to know about this? They'll be contacted by the division investigators, Helen said. Today, Helen paused. Likely today, yes. And if they don't have legal representation, Helen looked at her. I can make calls, Helen said slowly. How many pro bono cases can you handle? Sarah, I'm asking seriously. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then, let me call 2 colleagues, she said. Sarah nodded. She picked up the coffee pot because there were cups that needed filling, and she had been standing in one place too long, and she needed to move. She was at the far end of the counter when the door opened and Donna Caverly walked in. Donna, who had called at 7:43 the morning after the storm, with that one-word accusation of a greeting. Donna, who had been the informal information hub of the county for 40 years, and who therefore knew Sarah was certain everything that had happened this morning before she even walked through the door. Donna sat at the counter. She looked at Sarah. I heard about the bank, she said. Word travels, Sarah said. Word always travels. Donna wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. I also heard about the 4 other businesses. Okay. Rogers Hardware, Donna said. Oh, I am? Frank Rogers. He's been sick for 2 months, thought it was the stress of the foreclosure. His wife Betty told me last week she didn't know how they were going to manage. She looked at the counter. I've known Frank and Betty for 30 years. Sarah said nothing. And the Patel family at the motel on Route 12 South, Donna continued. Sanjay and Priya, 2 kids in school, they moved here from Michigan 12 years ago and built that place from nothing. She paused. She stopped. I wasn't always as welcoming to them as I should have been when they first came. She said it quietly and she said it plainly, and she didn't dress it up or excuse it, and Sarah gave her credit for that. There's going to be a lot of that today, Sarah said. A lot of people thinking about what they assumed and whether they were right. Donna looked up at her. That seems fair, she said. Yes, Sarah said, it does. The door opened again. Another car, more people, the ongoing steady arrival that had not really stopped since the day after the storm. The booth by the window filled. The table near the door filled. Tommy moved between them with the focused efficiency of someone who had leveled up his bussing skills considerably in the past 72 hours. Emma appeared from the back with a tray of water glasses, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew this task was important and was treating it that way. She set the glasses down at the booth by the window without spilling a drop. Looked up, saw her mother watching her, and gave a small, private smile. Sarah smiled back. Outside, Phil yelled something to someone on the ground about a roofing nail, and there was laughter and the sound of work continued. At the counter, Donna Caverly finished her coffee and set down the exact amount it cost, plus a tip that was more than the coffee, and she pulled on her coat and then she paused at the door. Sarah, she said, Donna, your father would have thought what you did the other night was exactly right. She said it looking at the door, not at Sarah in the way people say things when they mean them too much for eye contact. He would have been very proud. She left before Sarah could answer, which was probably just as well, because Sarah Mitchell was not going to cry in her own diner. She had decided this firmly. She turned back to the counter and discovered that Jack Reynolds had come inside at some point during the last few minutes and was sitting at the counter with his coffee and his particular quality of attention, and he was looking at her with an expression she had seen before but had never been able to name. She thought she might have a name for it now. It was the expression of someone watching something they were glad to have been part of. Phil says the roof needs 3 days, not 2, he said. Does Phil have 3 days? Phil says for this job he's got whatever it takes. She looked at him. Jack, she said, the hold on the foreclosure. I heard, he said. Helen called me before she called you, actually. She wanted me to be here when you found out. He paused. I hope that's okay. She thought about objecting to that, about the pride thing, about the way she had built her life on not needing people to be here for the moments that mattered, because needing that had always seemed like a risk that the world had not consistently rewarded. She thought about a door, about what it cost to open it and what it gave. It's okay, she said. Good, he said. He picked up his coffee. She picked up the pot. Outside, the sound of Phil's crew on the roof, the sound of the electricians in the wall, the sound of a parking lot full of people who had come back, not because anyone asked them to, but because they had decided this place was worth coming back for. Inside, a full diner on a Thursday morning in December. And at the counter, a woman who had not slept enough and had not eaten enough and had spent 4 days running on coffee and stubbornness and something she was only beginning to understand was not stubbornness at all. Something closer to faith, not the kind you inherit or the kind you earn, by opening a door when everyone tells you to lock it, and then finding out slowly, one person at a time, that the world behind that door was larger and kinder and more complicated than anyone standing on the outside had known to expect. She refilled Jack's coffee. He didn't say thank you, which she had realized was because he was the kind of person who expressed gratitude through action rather than words, and she had decided she respected that. The door opened again. She looked up, and standing in the doorway, stamping snow from his boots, was Frank Rogers. She didn't know him well. He had come into the diner maybe a handful of times over the years. A quiet man in his 60s with the weathered, patient look of someone who has run a hardware store for 30 years and learned to wait for things to either fix themselves or ask for help. He looked thinner than she remembered. He looked tired in the specific way of people who have been fighting something invisible. He stood in the doorway and looked at the full diner and the working building and the people at the counter, and his expression moved through several things very quickly. Confusion, recognition, something that had not quite resolved itself yet. His eyes found Sarah. She came around the counter. Mr. Rogers, she said. Frank, come in. He looked at her. Something in his face was working. Helen Carr called me this morning, he said. She said, he stopped. She said, you. Come in, Sarah said again. Sit down, I'll get you some coffee. You don't even know me, he said. I know you have a hardware store, and you've been in trouble with the same bank I've been in trouble with, she said. That's enough. He came inside. He sat at the counter. Sarah poured his coffee, and he held the mug the way Ethan Cole had held the tea she put in front of him 3 nights ago, the way people hold warm things when they have been cold for a long time. Jack Reynolds looked at the man next to him. Jack Reynolds, he said, and held out his hand. Frank Rogers looked at the man in the Hells Angels jacket next to him and took his hand without hesitation. Frank Rogers, he said. We're going to figure this out, Jack said. Not a promise, not a guarantee. Just a statement of intent, said with the particular quiet conviction of someone who has been keeping his word for a long time and has no plan to stop. Frank Rogers looked at the counter. Then he nodded once firmly, and the diner continued around them, loud and warm and full, with Emma carrying water glasses through it like she owned the place, which in some ways she did, and Phil's crew on the roof, and Helen somewhere on her phone making calls, and the particular smell of coffee, and something good from the kitchen, and the door swinging open and open and open. Frank Rogers drank his coffee slowly, the way a man drinks something when he needs the time it takes more than he needs the coffee itself. Sarah watched him from the other side of the counter without making it obvious she was watching him. She had learned this from her father, how to keep an eye on someone without making them feel observed, how to be present without being intrusive, how to let a person sit with something until they were ready to put it down. Frank was carrying a lot. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the way his hands stayed wrapped around the mug, even after it had stopped being warm enough to matter. He had the specific stillness of someone who has been holding themselves together through an act of will for a long time and has recently been told they might be allowed to stop. He looked up at her after a few minutes. 31 years, he said. The hardware store, she said. Built it myself, started with a lease on a building that was falling apart and a loan from my wife's parents that I paid back every single cent of within 4 years. He said it without pride, exactly, more with the directness of someone reciting facts that matter, because they represent something. Betty and I worked 12-hour days for the first 8 years. Our kids grew up in the back of that store. My son did his homework on a box of 2x4s. I know what that's like, Sarah said. He looked at her. I know you do, he said. I've been watching this diner since you were about Emma's age and your father was running it. Your dad was a good man. He was, she said. He would have done exactly what you did the other night, Frank said. With the bikers. He wouldn't have hesitated. She had heard that twice now in 3 days from Donna and now from Frank, and both times it had landed the same way, like a hand placed on a sore spot, not to hurt it, but to acknowledge it. The bank, she said. When did they first contact you? Frank set the mug down. 7 months ago, he said. First letter was almost polite. Just a notice, they said. Standard procedure. I called them, they put me on hold for 40 minutes and then told me someone would follow up. Someone did follow up, a man named Garrett Pullman, and he was very helpful, he said. He laid out the options. He explained the timeline. Frank's jaw tightened. He told me I had 60 days from the date of his letter. And Helen called me this morning at 7, Frank said. She told me the 60 days started from the recorded filing date, not the letter date, and the filing date was 9 days before Pullman's letter. He looked at his hands. 9 days. He swallowed 9 days, and I never knew. He did the same thing to me, Sarah said. He did it to all of us. Frank looked up. Helen said 5 businesses. 5, Sarah confirmed. Sanjay Patel, Frank said. I know Sanjay. I've sold him hardware for 12 years. Good man, careful. The kind of man who dots every I and triple checks every number. He shook his head. If he got caught by this, nobody was safe from it. Jack Reynolds, who had been sitting 2 stools down, giving them the courtesy of their conversation, looked over. The whole thing was designed to be uncatchable, he said. That's what Helen explained to me. The timeline manipulation is small enough that most people don't question it. They accept the date they're given because they're already scared, and the last thing you do when you're scared is go looking for more information. He counted on people being too overwhelmed to check, Sarah said. That's predatory, Frank said. The word came out flat and hard, stripped of the careful modulation he'd been using. That is predatory. There's no other word for it. Helen has another word for it, Jack said. Several, actually. Most of them are legal terms. One of them is fraud. Frank absorbed this. Is Pullman going to face something real? He said. Not just a fine, not just a professional reprimand, something real. Jack looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Frank. Helen says the state investigators have been building this for 6 weeks, she said. They have documentation from all 5 cases. They have communications between Pullman and the Acquisition, LLC. They have, she paused. She used the phrase, a very complete picture. She said it the way lawyers say things when they mean something is going to happen. Frank was quiet. His hands were still around the mug. My wife doesn't know how bad it got, he said very quietly. Betty, she knows we've been in trouble, but she doesn't know. I didn't want to. She's been sick this winter. Nothing serious, but I didn't want to add to it. So I've been handling it alone. He stopped. 7 months of handling it alone. Sarah said nothing. She understood the specific geography of that sentence, the distance a person covers alone, the weight that accumulates when there's no one to hand it to even briefly. Frank, she said, call Betty. He looked at her. Call her right now, she said. Tell her Helen Carr is your attorney and she's filing on your behalf as part of a consolidated complaint and the foreclosure has been temporarily held. Tell her you've been sitting at a counter in a diner on Route 12 with a Hells Angels chapter president and a hardware store owner figuring out how to fight back. Tell her all of it. Frank Rogers blinked. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He stood up and went to the quiet corner by the window. Sarah heard him say Betty, and then his voice dropped to something she couldn't follow, which was as it should be. She went back to work. Helen Carr returned to the diner at 1 in the afternoon with 2 other people. Sarah hadn't met a woman introduced as Claire Vasquez, family and small business law, and a man named David Okafor, who specialized in banking regulation. They took the large corner booth and spread papers across it with the focused efficiency of people who were used to working in the field, and within 20 minutes they had converted Sarah's corner booth into something that functioned like a pop-up legal office. Sarah kept them in coffee. At 1:30, Sanjay Patel arrived. She recognized him because she had bought gas at his motel's adjacent station 100 times over the years, a quiet, precise man who always remembered her order when she came in, which she had always thought was a remarkable quality in a person who dealt with hundreds of people a day. He came in with his wife Priya, who had the particular watchful alertness of someone who has been managing a crisis quietly for months and is trying to determine whether this room is safe to be less guarded in. Sarah brought them to Helen's table and introduced them and stood back because that was what the moment required. It was Priya who stopped her on the way back to the counter. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "I want to say something." Sarah stopped. "When we moved here 12 years ago," Priya said, "people were not unkind exactly, but cautious, in the way that people are cautious about things they're not used to." She said it without accusation, with the same directness Sarah had come to associate with people who had processed a thing fully and come out the other side of it. The diner was one of the first places that felt completely normal. Your father didn't look at us any differently. He just took our order and made sure the coffee was good. Sarah held that. "He was like that," she said. "This whole thing," Priya gestured at the room, at the papers on the table, at the sounds from outside. "What you did the other night and then all of this, I want you to know, it matters more than what it looks like. On the surface, it looks like legal help and a roof repair. But underneath," she stopped. "Underneath, it's someone saying that what happened to us wasn't right and we're not going to let it stand. And that's different from anything we've had in 7 months." Sarah looked at this woman she barely knew, who had been fighting the same invisible war she had been fighting and had been doing it the same way, quietly, alone, without wanting to make a fuss. "You should have had it sooner," Sarah said. "I'm sorry it took this long." Priya shook her head. "You didn't know about us," she said. "But he knew about all of us. That was the design." She looked at the table where Helen and her colleagues were spreading out papers. "Now somebody does." She went back to the table. Sarah went back to the counter. The afternoon brought the thing that Sarah had been both expecting and dreading, and it arrived at 2:47 in the shape of a television news van from Billings, which pulled into the parking lot and sat there with its satellite equipment and its particular quality of announced intention. She was aware of it before it became a problem, because Tommy, who had developed a useful habit of monitoring the parking lot, appeared at the service window and said, "Ms. Mitchell, there's a news van." "I see it," she said. "What do we do?" "Nothing yet," she said. "They can sit there. Sitting there doesn't hurt anybody." She had been thinking about this since Patricia Kim's call that morning. She had been turning it over the way she turned over difficult things, looking at it from the angles that were easy and the ones that weren't, trying to find the shape of what was actually right, rather than what was merely comfortable. Jack found her at the window. "Billings affiliate," he said. "Patricia Kim called them," she said. "Probably," he said. "Or they found the Facebook post themselves. It's at about 40,000 shares." She turned to look at him. 40,000, she said. "Last time Dennis checked," he said. "That was an hour ago. It's likely more now." She thought about 40,000 people who had looked at a 3-paragraph post about a single mother and 70 stranded bikers and decided to pass it on. About what that meant. About how it had set in motion a legal discovery, in a banking investigation, in a Thursday full of people in her diner, in a parking lot full of work that should have happened years ago. "If I talk to them," she said, "if I give them something, not the human interest story, not the bikers and the single mom, but the real story, the bank Pullman, the 5 businesses, the investigation. If that becomes visible, more pressure on the investigation," Jack said. "Harder for it to get quietly buried. And harder for Pullman to negotiate his way into something small," she said. "Yes." She was quiet. "I don't want you and your people to be the story," she said. "I don't want 70 men who did something decent to spend the next 3 weeks getting called for interviews and having their history dug up. They helped because it was the right thing not to be on television." Jack looked at her with that steady, level gaze. "Let me make a call," he said. He went outside. She watched him through the window, standing in the parking lot, phone to his ear. The news van about 50 feet away, with 2 people visible inside it waiting. He came back in 4 minutes. "I talked to Dennis," he said, "and to Rosie. Between the 2 of them, they speak for the group." He paused. "They say whatever you decide, they're behind it. And Dennis specifically said, He stopped and something moved through his expression. Dennis said if talking to those cameras helps Frank Rogers keep his hardware store, then talk to those cameras. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she took off her apron, which she had been wearing since 5:30 in the morning, and she folded it over the counter and she straightened her shirt. "Tell Tommy to handle the counter," she said. She went outside. The reporter was a young man named Chris Avery. She had expected Patricia Kim, but Patricia Kim was print, and this was television, and the world divides its stories among its formats. And he was 28 at most, with the particular combination of practiced calm and underlying eagerness of someone who knows this is a bigger story than his usual assignment and is trying not to let that show. He met her at the edge of the parking lot. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, "thank you for coming out." "I have conditions," she said. He blinked. "Of course." "The story is the banking fraud investigation. That's what matters, and that's what needs air. I will talk about my experience, and I will talk about the 5 businesses, and I will talk about Helen Carr and the legal proceedings. I will not make this about bikers and a single mom. The people who helped me deserve better than being a news hook. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Chris Avery looked at her steadily. "I understand," and he said, "if you use the footage to run a human interest piece that buries the investigation story, I'll go on record with every other outlet in the state and describe this conversation in detail," she said, not aggressively, just precisely. "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you what will happen. I think you deserve to know that in advance." He didn't flinch. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, "I went to J school because I wanted to do stories that mattered. This is a story that matters. I don't want to do a different version of it any more than you want me to." She looked at him. He held the look. "Okay," she said, "let's talk." The camera ran for 20 minutes. She told it about the loans, about the timeline manipulation, about Garrett Pullman, about the 5 businesses, about Helen Carr, and the consolidated complaint. She said Sanjay Patel's name and Frank Rogers' name because they had both told her they were willing to be named and because the story was more powerful with real people in it than without. She said once near the end that none of this would have surfaced without a group of people who had needed somewhere to come in from the cold and a woman who had decided to let them in. She said it once plainly, and she did not elaborate. Chris Avery thanked her. She went back inside. At 3:15, Helen Carr came to the counter with a look on her face that Sarah had learned in the course of one day to read. "What happened?" Sarah said, not a question. "The state investigators have requested a meeting with Pullman," Helen said. "Formal, recorded. His attorney is already in the room." She paused. "This is moving faster than I expected." "How fast?" "The television footage is going to run on the 6 o'clock news," Helen said. "The investigators asked us to hold the consolidated complaint until after the broadcast. They think the public visibility will make it harder for the bank to stonewall." She looked at Sarah. "They're using your story as leverage." Sarah absorbed that. "Is that a good thing?" she said. "In this case, yes," Helen said. "They have the documentation. The investigation is solid. What they needed was momentum and public attention, and you've given them both." She put her hand briefly on the counter, a gesture that was not quite touching Sarah's hand, but was in that direction. "Sarah, this is going well." "Define well," Sarah said. "Better than most cases I take," Helen said. "Not guaranteed, not finished, but better." She picked up her coffee. "By tomorrow morning, Pullman is going to know that the story is out, the investigation is public, and 5 business owners have legal representation in consolidated standing. That changes his calculations significantly." "What's his calculation right now?" "His calculation right now is that he can negotiate something quiet that protects him and costs him as little as possible." Helen's voice was precise. "By tomorrow, that calculation won't survive contact with reality." Sarah said nothing for a moment. "Frank Rogers," she said, "if Pullman's timeline manipulation is proven and the foreclosure proceedings are invalid, Frank's store stays Frank's store," Helen said. "Same for the Patels, same for the others, same for you." She looked at Sarah directly. "I am not going to let these people lose what they built. That is a statement of professional intent, not a guarantee. But I need you to hear it." Sarah heard it. The 6 o'clock news ran the story as its lead segment. Sarah watched it on the small television mounted in the corner of the diner, which she normally never turned on, because her father had believed a diner should be full of conversation and not screens, but which was on now because Tommy had turned it on, and everyone in the diner had organically arranged themselves to see it, and she hadn't had the heart to say no. It was 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Chris Avery had done what he said he would do. The lead was the bank, the fraud, the 5 businesses, Pullman's name in the investigation. The footage of the diner was background, not foreground. Helen was interviewed for 30 seconds and was precise and devastating in the way she was precise and devastating about everything. Sanjay Patel spoke for 20 seconds about what it felt like to be told you had 60 days when you actually had 69. Frank Rogers spoke for 15 seconds and said only this: "I built that store for my family. Someone tried to take it by lying to me about when. Now someone's making it right." Sarah was in the footage twice. Once walking across the parking lot toward the camera, and once speaking the bit she'd said near the end about people who had needed somewhere to come in from the cold. The diner was quiet during those 3 minutes and 40 seconds. When it was over, nobody said anything for a beat. Then Emma, who had been watching from the end of the counter with her chin in her hands, in the particular focused attention she brought to things that interested her, said, "Mom, you're on TV." "I noticed," Sarah said. "You look serious," Emma said. "I was being serious." "You look like you do when you're talking to the bank," Emma said, "like you're not going to move." Several people in the diner laughed. Sarah looked at her daughter, this small, exact, entirely clear-eyed person who noticed everything and filed it and produced it at the precise moment it was most accurate, and felt something that she didn't have a word for, something that was love, but was also something else, something more specific. Pride, maybe, or recognition. The feeling of seeing yourself in someone and being glad about what you see. "Yeah," she said, "that's about right." The call came at 8:45 that night. The diner was winding down the last tables, clearing, Tommy running the final sweep, Carol stacking chairs with the proprietary efficiency of someone who had appointed herself to the task and was not leaving until it was done. Emma had gone upstairs an hour ago, not without protest, but Sarah had played the school day card, and Emma had accepted it with the grace of someone who knows when an argument is winnable and when it isn't. Jack was still there. He had stayed through the afternoon and the evening, moving between outside and inside, between the workers and the diner present, without being in the way. Phil's crew had made significant progress on the roof and had covered the rest against the weather and would be back in the morning. The electricians had completed the east wall work and had left a list which Dennis had delivered to Sarah at 5 o'clock of 3 additional items they recommended and their approximate cost and timeline. She hadn't looked at the list yet. She'd put it in her pocket and kept moving because the day had been the day and the list could wait until she was alone. The call came from Helen. "I have news," Helen said. Sarah moved to the back hall. "Tell me," she said. "Pullman's attorney made contact with the investigators at 7 o'clock this evening," Helen said. "He is offering a full cooperation agreement." Sarah was very still. "He's cooperating," she said. "His attorney is negotiating the terms," Helen said. "But the direction is cooperation, which means testimony, which means the acquisition LLC gets named, which means the whole structure comes apart." She paused, and in the pause, Sarah could hear the particular quality of a person who has been fighting a thing for a long time and is watching it begin to fall. "Sarah, this is what I needed 6 weeks to get someone to pay attention to. And it's happening now because of a Facebook post about your diner." "It's happening because you built the case," Sarah said. "I built the case," Helen said. "You made it visible. Both things matter." Sarah leaned against the wall. "The 5 businesses," she said. "All 5, Helen said. "The hold on foreclosure proceeding stands pending the investigation. Given the cooperation agreement, the investigators expect expedited resolution. We're talking weeks, not months." She paused. "Sarah, I need you to hear what I'm saying. This is not maybe. The cooperation agreement means the manipulation is being admitted to, which means the foreclosure timelines were fraudulent, which means they cannot stand." Sarah Mitchell pressed her hand flat against the wall of the back hall. She thought about the foreclosure notice she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold lines. She thought about the counter she had pressed her hands against 2 days in a row. She thought about a door. Okay, she said. That's all you've got, Helen said. There was something warm in her voice. I'm processing, Sarah said. Take your time, Helen said. I'll send the full update in writing tonight. And Sarah, she paused. You did something right by talking to that reporter today. That took courage. I had good advice, Sarah said. You had good instincts, Helen said. The advice just confirmed them. She hung up. Sarah stood in the back hall. She stood there for a while. Then she went back out to the counter because that was where she went when she needed to do something with her hands. And doing something with her hands had always been how she processed the things that were too large to sit still with. Jack was at the counter. He looked at her face. Helen, he said, not a question. Pullman is cooperating, she said. He was quiet for a moment. And the 5 businesses, he said. The foreclosures are gone, she said. Or they will be. Weeks, Helen said, not months. Jack Reynolds put his coffee cup down. He looked at the counter. He nodded once in the way he nodded when something had resolved, the way he thought it should resolve without making a performance of having been right. Carol Stacks, who had been stacking chairs nearby and was not subtle about the fact that she had heard said, "Oh, thank God," in the plain, full-throated way of someone who has been holding their breath and is done with that. Sarah looked at her. Carol, she said. I know, Carol said. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was just, she gestured at the chairs. I was nearby. You were eavesdropping, Sarah said. I was nearby and the hall is not soundproof, Carol said firmly and resumed stacking chairs. Tommy had paused his sweeping. Ms. Mitchell, he said, It's going to be okay, she said. Tommy Reyes, who was 16 and had worked for her for 8 months and had over the past 4 days become someone she thought of as not just an employee, but something closer to a person she was responsible for, looked at her with an expression that was too old for his face and exactly right for the moment. Good, he said. That's good. He went back to sweeping. She found the list in her pocket at 9:15 after the last person had left, and the diner was empty and quiet in the specific way it was quiet at the end of a long day. Not empty, but resting the way a place rests that has been full of people and is remembering them. She sat at the counter and read Dennis's list. 3 items: kitchen exhaust system which had been losing efficiency for 2 years, a structural crack in the rear foundation that Phil had found while checking the roofline, and that needed attention before spring freeze-thaw made it worse. And the front steps, the left railing, which wobbled, which Emma had been wobbling back and forth her whole childhood the way children do with things that move when they shouldn't. The steps her father had built. The railing her father had installed on a Saturday in 1994, according to the faded notation in the notebook he'd kept of every repair ever made to the building, a notebook she had found in his desk after he died and had not been able to throw away. She sat with the list. Jack was still there. He had not announced he was leaving, and she had not asked him to, and they had arrived at a point in the past 4 days where this was simply a thing that was true. He was there when things happened, and this was neither explained nor required to be. He sat beside her and looked at the list when she set it on the counter between them. Front steps, he said. The railing, she said. Emma's been wobbling it, he said. He had watched Emma wobble it approximately 6 times over the past 4 days, each time with an identical expression of tolerant observation. Since she was 3, Sarah said. My dad tried to fix it 3 separate times. It always came loose again. Dennis, Jack said, knows a man who welds. Sarah looked at him. I'm serious, Jack said. He knows a man in Butte who does ironwork. If you want that railing to stay put, he can make that railing stay put. She looked at the list. She thought about her father and the notebook with every repair in it written in his careful, slightly crooked handwriting, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write left-handed after breaking his right wrist at 19 and never entirely going back. Tell Dennis to call his man in Butte, she said. Jack took out his phone. She sat at her counter. The diner was quiet and full at the same time the way it always was at this hour, full of the residue of the day, of the people who had been here and left their particular quality of presence behind. Frank Rogers at the counter, hands around a mug. Priya Patel's carefully chosen words. Dale Hurst going outside to find Dennis. Emma with her tray of water glasses, serious as a judge. She thought about what Rosie had said on the morning the bikers left standing with her helmet in her hand. Your dad built the building. You built what happens here. She had been trying to build what happened here for 4 years, alone mostly, with Emma, who was both a reason and a companion, never a burden, always an anchor. With the ghost of her father's particular way of doing things, the extra coffee refill, without being asked, the greeting that remembered your name, the deliberate, unhurried quality of service that communicated that you had time to be here, that your presence was not an inconvenience, but a reason. She had been building it with what she had, which had never been enough money and had always been enough care. And then one night the storm came and a boy went down in the parking lot, and she had 3 seconds to decide, and she chose the thing she would always choose when stripped of hesitation down to what she actually was. She opened the door, and everything that followed had followed from that. Jack put his phone in his pocket. "Dennis's man in Butte says he can be here Saturday," he said. "Saturday's good," she said. She looked at the front door, at the handle she had put her hand on 6 days ago while Dale Hurst told her not to. She thought about what it had cost her to open it. 3 seconds of fear pressed down and set aside the choice made before the cost was fully calculated. She thought about what it had given her. Not the legal proceedings, though those were real and they mattered enormously. Not the roof work or the electrical or the welding man from Butte, though all of it was real and all of it mattered. What it had given her was something harder to name. The knowledge that when she was stripped down to what she actually was, she was the kind of person who opens the door. That was not a small thing. That was in fact the only thing. "Jack," she said. "Yeah. Thank you," she said, "for all of it. For Helen, for Dennis, for Phil, for Garrett Foyle and his materials at cost, for coming back 3 days after you left, when you didn't have to." She said it looking at him the way Ethan had said thank you to her, with the directness she had admired in the boy and was now trying to bring to this moment. "I know you said it wasn't charity. I know you said it was respect. I think it was both, and I think I'm allowed to be grateful for both." Jack Reynolds looked at the counter for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You gave 70 people a floor to sleep on when the world told you to lock the door," he said. "You gave Frank Rogers a seat at your counter. You gave Sanjay and Priya Patel a shot at something they'd stop with, believing they were going to get." He held her gaze. "Sarah, you are what you do. What you do is open the door. Everything else is the rest of us trying to be worthy of that." The diner was quiet. The heating duct on the east wall did not rattle. The coffee maker finished its overnight cycle. Somewhere upstairs, Emma Mitchell slept in her room with the yellow stars on the ceiling, that her father, the absent one, the one who had disappeared years ago and left a gap shaped like himself in the life of a woman and a little girl who had filled it slowly and, with great effort, with other things had painted there when Emma was 2, the only decent thing Sarah had sometimes thought he had ever done for either of them. The stars were still there. The diner was still here. She was still here. And tomorrow Phil's crew would come back for the roof. And Dennis's man from Butte would come Saturday for the railing. And Helen would send documents, and the investigation would proceed, and Pullman would cooperate, and 5 businesses would find out they were going to be okay. And the door would open again, the way it always opened, because a diner on Route 12 in Montana was a place where people stopped, had always been a place where people stopped, and Sarah Mitchell intended to keep it that way for as long as she was standing behind that counter. She picked up her father's coffee pot. There was still half a cup left in it, which was not enough to justify making more, but was enough for 2 people if they split it. She looked at Jack. "Last of the coffee," she said. He held out his cup. She poured. The Saturday morning that Dennis's man from Butte came to fix the railing was the same morning Sarah Mitchell received the letter from the Montana Division of Banking and Financial Institutions. She knew what it was before she opened it. The envelope had the specific weight of something official, something that had been written by people who chose their words with the understanding that words on paper carry consequences. She stood at the counter with it in her hand for a full minute before she opened it, which was not like her. She was not a person who delayed things, but this particular moment felt like something she wanted to be deliberate about. Emma was watching her from the end of the counter. "Mom," Emma said. "Give me a second," Sarah said. "You've been giving yourself a second for like 3 minutes. "Emma." "I'm just saying," Emma said, and went back to her cereal. Sarah opened the letter. She read it twice, not because it was unclear, because she needed the second reading to believe the first one. Garrett Pullman had entered a full cooperation agreement with the Montana Division of Banking and Financial Institutions. His testimony had confirmed the existence of a coordinated scheme involving the manipulation of foreclosure timelines across seven, not 5-7 small businesses in the Route 12 corridor, and the facilitated acquisition of distressed properties by a third-party investment LLC in which Pullman held an undisclosed financial interest. The scheme had operated for 3 years. The banking division had referred the matter to the State Attorney General's Office for criminal prosecution. All foreclosure proceedings against the affected properties were permanently voided. Permanently, not held, not delayed, voided. Sarah read that word 3 times. She set the letter on the counter. She put both hands flat on the surface of the counter, her father's counter, the counter she had stood behind through 4 years of grinding solitary effort, and she pressed down the way she had pressed down before, except this time it was different. This time she was not steadying herself against bad news. She was steadying herself against something she did not yet fully know how to hold. "Mom," Emma's voice had changed. She had put down her spoon. "What does it say?" Sarah looked at her daughter. "It says we're okay," she said. Emma looked at her for a long moment with those October Creek eyes. "Okay like fine," Emma said. "Or okay like actually okay." "Okay like actually okay," Sarah said. "The diner is ours. It stays ours." Emma was off the stool and had her arms around Sarah's waist before Sarah finished the sentence. And Sarah put her hands on her daughter's back and held on, and the diner was quiet around them. And outside, that she could hear the sound of Dennis's man from Butte, already working on the railing. The specific sound of metalwork being done correctly, clean and deliberate and permanent. She let herself cry then, just briefly, just enough. Emma didn't say anything. Emma had always had, even at 8 years old, the unusual wisdom to understand when a person needed to be held rather than spoken to. Sarah held her daughter and looked at the letter on the counter and thought about all the mornings she had stood at the kitchen sink telling herself she was not panicking. All the nights she had run the math that never worked. All the fold lines in the paper she had read until the paper went soft. She thought about a storm, about a parking lot, about a boy on the ground, about 3 seconds. She called Helen first. Helen answered on the second ring, which told Sarah that Helen had been expecting the call, which meant Helen had already known, which meant Helen had probably been the one who made it happen in the way that lawyers make things happen, quietly with precision, leaving the official notification to arrive through its proper channel while the actual work was already done. "You got the letter," Helen said. "I got the letter," Sarah said. "Permanently voided," Helen said, and in her voice was the particular satisfaction of a person who has been building towards something for 6 weeks and has watched it land. 7 businesses, Sarah said, not 5. "The investigators found 2 more in the documentation Pullman turned over," Helen said. "Families we didn't even know to look for. One of them had already signed a deed in lieu. We're working to reverse it." She paused. "The Attorney General is moving fast. Pullman is not going to negotiate his way into something small. He understood that when he saw the 6 o'clock news." Sarah thought about standing in the parking lot in front of Chris Avery's camera, about the conditions she had set, about his face when she set them, and the way he had held her gaze and said, "I went to Jay's school because I wanted to do stories that mattered." "Tell me about the family that already signed the deed," Sarah said. "Sarah, tell me." A pause. "Nemesis Vasquez, not Claire different in family, Ramon and Lucia Vasquez. They ran a small auto repair shop about 30 miles east of you on Route 12. 2 adult sons who worked there. They signed the deed in lieu 8 weeks ago because Pullman told them they had no other options. They've been living on their oldest son's salary since then. Can it actually be reversed?" "We think so," Helen said. "The signature was obtained under fraudulent duress. The scheme is now a matter of criminal record. We're filing the challenge next week." She paused again. "Claire Vasquez, the attorney who sat in the corner booth at your diner Thursday, her last name is a coincidence. But when I told her about Ramon and Lucia, she volunteered to take the challenge as additional pro bono. She was still sitting at your counter when she made that decision." Sarah stood at the counter. She thought about Donna Caverly saying her father would have been proud. She thought about the specific weight of that and what it meant to hear it and what it meant to now understand that the reach of what had happened in her diner extended past Frank Rogers and the Patels and herself past the 7 businesses in the letter down Route 12 to a family named Vasquez, who had no idea when they signed a piece of paper 8 weeks ago that felt like the end, that somewhere down the road, someone was going to open a door in a storm, and eventually by a chain of events that no one could have predicted, the door would reach them too. Helen, she said, thank you. Sarah, Helen said, you started this. I opened a door, Sarah said. Yes, Helen said, and everything else followed from that. The news about Pullman's criminal referral broke publicly at noon on Saturday, and by 1 o'clock, Route 12 was busy in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. Patricia Kim's piece in the Billings Gazette ran online at 12:30, 1,200 words careful and sourced, and exactly what she had promised it would be, and by 1 it had been shared more times than Tommy could keep up with, counting which he was doing on his phone behind the counter, because he had decided this was part of his job now, and Sarah had stopped arguing about it. Frank Rogers called at 1:15. He didn't say much. He said, Helen called me. And then he said, Betty cried for 20 minutes. And then he said, I need to come see you. And Sarah said, the door's open, Frank. And he said, I know it is, and hung up. Sanjay Patel texted, which was somehow exactly right. Sanjay expressed things in precise, efficient language, and what he sent was Priya and I will be there at 3. We are bringing food. Please do not argue about this. Sarah texted back, okay. Then after a second she added, thank you. Then after another second she added, both of you. Sanjay replied with a single period, which she had learned meant that something had landed somewhere important, and he was done with words about it. At 1:30, Ethan Cole walked through the door. She didn't expect him. She looked up from the counter, and there he was, color fully returned, standing straight, wearing a jacket with no patches on it, because he was not. She now knew a full member, but a prospect still working his way towards something, still becoming whoever he was going to be. He had driven 4 hours from Billings because he had seen the news, and because he told her he had something he needed to say in person. You don't have to have a reason, Sarah said. You're always welcome here. I know, he said, but I have one anyway. He sat at the counter, the same stool he had occupied in the small hours of the storm night when he had told her about feeling invisible, and she had told him that the strongest thing a person can do is let someone help them. I talked to someone, he said, after I got back, a counselor, about the rough time I mentioned. He said it plainly with the same directness he had had before, but something in it was different now. Not easier exactly, but more deliberate, like a choice made rather than a confession extracted. Jack's been on me about it for a while. He paused. What you said that night helped me actually do it. What did I say, she said, that the strongest thing is letting someone help you. She looked at him. I'm glad, she said, simply and without decoration. I'm going to be okay, he said. I think I'm going to be okay. I think so too, she said. He stayed for lunch. He ate everything on his plate and ordered pie, and when Emma came downstairs and recognized him, she climbed onto the stool beside him and resumed explaining long division from exactly the point she had left off 3 days ago, as though no time had passed, and Ethan Cole listened with genuine attention and asked genuine questions, and Sarah watched the two of them from the other end of the counter and felt something she had no single word for, something layered, something that contained gratitude and tenderness and the specific quality of rightness that comes when things land where they are supposed to land. Frank Rogers arrived at 2 o'clock and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and did not say anything for a while, and Sarah let him not say anything. And then he said, I called my son this morning. Yeah, she said. My son, Marcus, he's in Denver now. He left 5 years ago, not because we had a falling out, but because there wasn't enough to keep him here. Not enough work, not enough future. He turned the mug. I called him this morning and I told him the store is ours. It's not going anywhere. And I told him, he stopped. I told him if he ever wanted to come back, then there was a place for him. What did he say? She said. Frank Rogers looked at the counter. He cried, he said. My son is 31 years old and he cried on the phone. He said it with a complicated expression. The expression of a father who has learned something about his child that he should have known sooner and is holding both things at once, the knowledge itself and the fact of its lateness. He said he didn't think there was anything to come back to. Is he coming back? She said. He's thinking about it, Frank said. That's more than I had this morning. That was the moment the door opened and Jack Reynolds walked in. He was alone this time. No group, no trucks, no organized arrival. Just Jack in his jacket, coming in the way he came in now, as though he had decided some days ago that this was somewhere he belonged and had simply continued acting on that decision. He sat at the counter, he looked at Frank, he looked at Sarah. "The letter," he said. "The letter," she confirmed. He nodded. They sat in the particular silence of people who have been through something together and have arrived at the part where the noise of it has settled and what's left is the thing itself, solid, real, changed. "Jack," Frank Rogers said. "Frank," Jack said. "I want to say something," Frank said, "and I want to say it directly." He turned on the stool to face Jack, a man in his 60s, turning to face a man in a Hells Angels jacket with the deliberate attention of someone making a point. "I have spent most of my adult life with a certain idea about people like you. The jacket, the bikes, all of it. And I want to tell you that I was wrong. I want to tell you that directly, man to man, because it deserves to be said that way." Jack Reynolds looked at him steadily. "I appreciate that," he said. "It's not enough," Frank said. "I know it's not enough, but it's what I've got right now and I'm giving it to you." "It's plenty," Jack said. "It's more than most people do." Frank nodded. He turned back to his coffee. Emma appeared from the kitchen with a plate of pie she had apparently decided to bring and set it in front of Frank with the grave authority of a child who is determined this is needed. And Frank looked at it and then at Emma, and something moved through his face that was recognizable to anyone who had ever been surprised by unexpected kindness in a moment they were unprepared for. "Thank you, young lady," he said. "You look like you needed PM," Emma said, and went back to whatever she had been doing. Frank Rogers ate his pie. At 3, the Patels arrived with enough food to feed the diner twice over, and by 3:30 the place was full again. Not with strangers passing through, but with people who had reason to be there, who had been part of the thing that had happened over the past week, who carried the specific energy of people who have come through something together and are choosing to mark it by being in the same room. Carol was there. Donna Caverly came, which surprised Sarah until it didn't. Tommy was there because he was always there, now had been there every day, had started coming in, even on the days he wasn't scheduled, because he wanted to see how things were going. Helen arrived at 4 with Claire and David, the legal team, who had apparently decided that the formal professional distance they had maintained in the corner booth could be set aside now that the work was done. Dennis drove up from Billings because Jack called him, and Jack had apparently learned that Dennis did not need much more reason than that. Rosie came, the woman with the gray braid who had helped in the kitchen the night of the storm. She had driven 3 hours from Missoula, and when she walked in, she looked around at the full diner and said to nobody and everybody, "Well, look at this." At some point, Sarah couldn't identify exactly when the way. You can't identify the exact moment a conversation becomes something more than a conversation. The diner became a celebration. Not planned, not announced, not organized, just a room full of people who had reason to feel something good and were choosing to feel it together, which is the oldest and most human form of celebration there is. She stood behind the counter and watched it, and she thought about her father. She thought about what he had wanted when he built this place. Not money, he had never made enough money for money to have been the point. Not fame, he had been a man who did his best work in the anonymity of an ordinary Tuesday. He had wanted a place where people could stop. That was the whole of it. A place on a long road where someone could put down what they were carrying for an hour and have something hot and go back to their life with slightly more than they had when they came in. She looked at the room and thought about how far that had traveled, how 70 people had stopped, how one boy going down in the cold had pulled her outside, how a chain of decisions, each one small and clear, had reached Frank Rogers in Denver, and a family named Vasquez 30 miles east, and Patricia Kim and Chris Avery, and Helen Carr, and ultimately Garrett Pullman, who had thought he could take things that belonged to people and had been wrong. Emma came to stand beside her behind the counter. This was a new habit, this standing beside her mother rather than at the end of the counter. Sarah had noticed it starting 2 days ago, Emma positioning herself in the specific space that was Sarah's space, as though she was learning something about what it meant to be the person behind this counter, and was beginning in her 8-year-old way the long process of deciding if it was something she wanted to be. "Mom," Emma said. "Yeah." "Are you happy?" Emma asked. Just like that. Direct the way she was always direct. Sarah looked at the room. At Frank eating Priya's home cooking with the expression of a man who hasn't eaten something made with genuine care in too long. at Ethan talking to Rosie about something that was making both of them laugh, at Jack at the counter drinking coffee, watching the room with his particular quality of attention, which she had come to understand was not watchfulness, but love, the specific love of someone who feels responsible for people and expresses it by paying attention. At Helen in the corner booth laughing at something David said the folio closed for the first time since Thursday. At Carol stacking something. Carol always stacking something. At Dennis and Tommy comparing up phones about something that was clearly funny. At the door which kept opening. "Yeah," Sarah said. "I am." Emma leaned against her briefly in the way she did when she had gotten what she came for and was ready to move on to the next thing. Then she went back into the room.
Charmer.
At the end of the night, after everyone had gone, after Frank had driven home to Betty, after the Patels had packed up the remaining food and left it with Carol, after Helen and her team had said their goodbyes, after Ethan had driven back toward Billings with his windows down, despite the cold because he had told Sarah it made him feel like something was behind him that used to be in front of him. After all of it, she was alone in the diner. Just her and the counter and the quiet. She picked up the sign from the shelf above the pass-through window. She had bought it 3 days ago at the hardware store because the hardware store was open again, and Frank Rogers had been there, and she had told him what she wanted, and he had found it for her in 20 minutes and refused to charge her, and she had refused to not pay, and they had compromised on cost, which was Frank's cost and not his markup, and that had felt right. The sign was small, painted wood. She had written the words herself in the careful, slightly crooked handwriting she had inherited from her father. She carried it to the front door. She hung it on the hook beside the entrance at eye level so that every person who came through that door in every season that followed would see it before they saw anything else. It said, "Everyone deserves a place to stop." She stepped back and looked at it. Her father had thought about that sign for 30 years and never put it up. She had put it up in a week, which felt about right, not because she was faster than him, but because she had learned what he had always known and had now lived it fully enough to say it in words above a door. She turned off the counter lights the way she did every night, the sequence her hands knew without being asked. She put her hand on the door handle. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the handle and thought about 6 days ago when she had stood in this exact position with Dale Hurst's voice in her ear and a boy going down in the parking lot in 3 seconds to decide. She had opened it then. She would open it again tomorrow. And the day after and the day after that, for as long as she was standing in this building on this road, in this stretch of Montana where people passed through going somewhere else and sometimes needed for an hour or a cup of coffee or a floor to sleep on and a storm somewhere to stop. She was that place. She had always been that place. She just knew it now. She turned off the last light. She went upstairs to her daughter. And Mitchell's Diner stood on Route 12 in the dark and the cold with a small sign by the door and a railing that no longer wobbled and a roof that was going to hold and the long road running past it in both directions carrying people toward whatever was next and the door ready as it had always been to open.